It is the late fall of 1975, and the biggest, most commercially successful rock band in America is quietly tearing itself apart from the inside out. They have just released an album that went straight to the #1 spot on the charts. They are selling out massive arenas from coast to coast, and their music is dominating radio stations across the globe. Yet, if you walk into their dressing room, the atmosphere feels less like a celebration and more like a war zone. The Eagles, the undisputed kings of the Southern California country rock movement, have hit a creative and personal brick wall. The music industry is shifting rapidly beneath their feet. The soft, breezy, acoustic-driven melodies that made them international superstars are suddenly starting to feel a little too safe, a little too quiet, and dangerously close to becoming outdated. Out in the massive football stadiums, bands like Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, and The Who are dropping sonic bombs on audiences, delivering heavy, aggressive, electric performances that leave fans deafened and begging for more. The Eagles are smart enough to realize a terrifying truth. If they do not find a way to get louder, heavier, and meaner, they are going to get left behind in the dust of the stadium rock era. But finding that heavier sound comes with a massive internal cost. The band is fundamentally divided. On one side are the founding architects of their success, Don Henley and Glenn Frey, two fiercely ambitious, ruthlessly calculated musicians who operate the band like a Fortune 500 company. On the other side is Bernie Leadon, the soul of their country authenticity, a master of the banjo and pedal steel who is growing sick and tired of the endless touring, the corporate machinery, and the move away from his beloved bluegrass roots. The tension builds and builds until it finally explodes in a dressing room after a show. In a moment of pure frustration and defiance, Leadon grabs a cold beer, pops the top, and calmly pours the entire contents directly over the head of Glenn Frey before walking out the door forever. The country rock era of the Eagles is dead in an instant. They are down a founding member, facing the biggest album cycle of their lives, and staring into an existential abyss. They desperately need a savior. They need a lead guitarist who can step onto a massive stage and deliver blistering, earth-shattering rock and roll firepower. What they get instead is a man who routinely brings chainsaws into five-star hotels to modify the furniture. A man personally mentored by Keith Moon in the dark, expensive art of property destruction. A man whose blood alcohol level is as legendary and terrifying as his guitar tone. This is the story of the greatest, most dangerous gamble in the history of rock and roll. This is the story of how the ultimate control freaks of the music business hired rock's craziest, most unpredictable guitarist, the legendary Joe Walsh, to save their career, and how that desperate roll of the dice accidentally created one of the best-selling albums in human history. If you love deep, unfiltered dives into the real history of rock music, hit that subscribe button right now, because we are heading straight into the madness of 1976. To truly understand why the Eagles were in such a desperate, vulnerable position at the end of 1975, you have to rewind and look at the foundation they had built their empire upon. The early 1970s Los Angeles music scene was centered around the Troubadour Club, a legendary venue where artists like Linda Ronstadt, Jackson Browne, and Joni Mitchell held court. The Eagles were born out of this exact environment. They started as a backing band for Linda Ronstadt before breaking out on their own, with a sound that perfectly captured the feeling of driving down a dusty desert highway with the top down. Hits like Take It Easy, Peaceful Easy Feeling, and Tequila Sunrise established them as the masters of country rock. At the center of this sound was Bernie Leadon. Leadon was not just a guitar player, he was a traditionalist. He had played with the Flying Burrito Brothers and possessed a deep, reverent understanding of bluegrass, folk, and traditional country music. His intricate acoustic fingerpicking and soaring banjo lines gave the Eagles a sense of rustic credibility that separated them from standard pop acts. But as the band became more successful, the dynamic began to shift. Glenn Frey and Don Henley were not content with just being a popular country rock band. They wanted to conquer the world. They were acutely aware of the changing cultural tides. The idealism of the 1960s had entirely evaporated, replaced by the cynical, hedonistic, and larger-than-life energy of the mid-1970s. Rock music was getting louder. Amplifiers were getting bigger. The fans filling the arenas didn't want to sit quietly and listen to a mandolin solo. They wanted their chests to vibrate from heavy bass lines and screaming electric guitars. The band had already started testing these heavier waters. They had brought in guitarist Don Felder during the recording of their third album, On the Border, specifically because they needed a nasty, biting slide guitar part for a track called Good Day in Hell. Felder's addition was a massive success, and he was quickly made a full-time member. But Felder's arrival pushed the band further into rock territory, which inevitably marginalized Leadon. By the time they released the One of These Nights album in 1975, the fracture was impossible to ignore. The album was a massive commercial triumph, hitting #1 and cementing their status as superstars, but internally, the band was miserable. Leadon felt completely alienated. He hated the stadium environment. He hated the grueling, never-ending tour schedules, and he deeply resented the dictatorial control that Frey and Henley exerted over the band's musical direction. Frey and Henley were notorious perfectionists. They mapped out every harmony, every solo, and every interview with the precision of military generals. For a free-spirited bluegrass musician like Leadon, it felt like being trapped in a corporate boardroom. The breaking point arrived in late 1975. The band was exhausted, burned out from the road, and constantly arguing about their future. Following a particularly tense show, the bickering continued into the dressing room. Leadon, finally reaching the absolute end of his patience with Frey's demands and the band's new direction, decided he had had enough. In a gesture that has since become rock and roll legend, Leadon grabbed a beer, cracked it open, and dumped it entirely over Glenn Frey's head. It was a silent, soaking declaration of independence. Leadon quit the band, leaving the Eagles without their founding musical anchor, right as they were supposed to begin work on the most important album of their lives. They were at a crossroads. They could try to find another country picker and retreat back to the safety of their early sound, or they could double down, find a heavy hitter, and fully commit to becoming a stadium rock band. They chose the latter, but the man they chose to bring into their tightly controlled world was a walking hurricane. Enter Joe Walsh. In 1975, if you were looking for a reliable, punctual, deeply disciplined studio musician who would quietly take orders, Joe Walsh was the absolute last person on planet Earth you would call. Walsh was already a massive rock star in his own right, and he carried a reputation that struck terror into the hearts of tour managers, hotel staff, and record executives everywhere. Walsh had burst onto the scene in the late 1960s with the James Gang, a hard-hitting power trio out of Cleveland. With the James Gang, Walsh proved he was a generational talent on the guitar, delivering the iconic, gritty, and eternally funky riff of Funk 49. His playing was completely different from the meticulous, studied style of the Los Angeles studio musicians. Walsh played with a raw, visceral, almost reckless energy. His tone was massive, his phrasing was unpredictable, and his rhythm playing was incredibly deeply pocketed. After burning out on the pressure of being the sole melodic instrument in a power trio, Walsh left the James Gang, moved to the mountains of Colorado, and formed the band Barnstorm, before transitioning into a highly successful solo career. He dropped the massive hit Rocky Mountain Way, pioneering the use of the talkbox long before Peter Frampton made it a household gimmick, and established himself as a solo artist who could fill arenas entirely on his own. But alongside his undeniable musical genius was a lifestyle so chaotic and destructive that it bordered on the mythological. Joe Walsh was affectionately and fearfully known in the industry as the Clown Prince of Rock. He was a brilliant prankster with a completely unhinged sense of humor and a massive substance abuse problem. While Henley and Frey were carefully managing their public image and plotting their next career move over mineral water, Walsh was operating in a completely different reality. His mentor in the dark arts of rock and roll excess was none other than Keith Moon, the legendary drummer for The Who. Moon had taken a liking to Walsh early on and decided to teach him that standard rock star behavior simply wasn't enough. Moon taught Walsh that breaking a television or throwing a chair was amateur work. If you were going to destroy a hotel room, you had to treat it like an avant-garde art project. Walsh took these lessons to heart. He became infamous for traveling with actual hardware tools. He didn't just break the furniture, he brought chainsaws on tour. He would literally fire up a gas-powered chainsaw in a 5-star hotel suite and begin modifying the floor plan, cutting doorways through adjoining walls just to see the look on the manager's face. In one legendary incident, Walsh and comedian John Belushi checked into a luxury hotel and managed to inflict $23,000 worth of damage to a single room in a matter of hours. Their primary objective the next morning wasn't to apologize, but to pack their bags, sprint to the rental car, and speed across state lines before the maid could unlock the door and discover the absolute wreckage they had left behind. Walsh was a man who lived entirely in the moment, fueled by copious amounts of alcohol and whatever else was handed to him in the backstage shadows. He was brilliant, he was hilarious, and he was completely and utterly out of control. This was the man that Irving Azoff, the ruthless and brilliant manager who happened to represent both the Eagles and Joe Walsh, decided to pitch as Bernie Leadon's replacement. Azoff saw the pure business synergy. He had the biggest band in the country looking for a harder edge, and he had a solo artist with incredible guitar chops who could provide exactly that edge. But when Azoff brought the idea to Henley and Frey, it felt like suggesting they invite a live hand grenade into their living room. The reaction from the music industry and the press was absolute bewilderment. When the rumors started circulating that Joe Walsh was going to join the Eagles, people thought it was a practical joke. Rolling Stone magazine and other music publications couldn't make sense of it. The culture clash was just too extreme. The Eagles were known as a hyper-controlled, meticulously clean-sounding band that demanded absolute perfection in the studio. Don Henley was famous for spending entire days just tweaking the tension on a snare drum to get the perfect thud. Glenn Frey was a brilliant arranger who did not tolerate missed cues or sloppy playing. They were a well-oiled corporate machine. Bringing Joe Walsh into that environment seemed like a recipe for immediate disaster. How could the gods of discipline possibly integrate a guy who might show up to a session entirely blacked out, carrying a chainsaw, and wearing a ridiculous oversized novelty hat? The fear within the Eagles camp was very real. They were terrified that Walsh's chaotic lifestyle would derail the band completely. They worried he wouldn't be able to handle the strict harmonies, or worse, that his massive, distorted guitar tone would completely bury the vocal arrangements that were the band's signature. But desperation breeds bold decisions. Henley and Frey knew that playing it safe would lead to their downfall. They knew that if they hired a predictable session player, they would just record another soft rock album and get swallowed alive by the changing times. They needed the danger. They needed the grit. They needed exactly what made Joe Walsh so terrifying. They agreed to let him into the inner circle. The first test was the rehearsal room. Walsh walked in, plugged his road-worn Fender Telecaster into a cranked tweed amplifier, and the moment he hit the first chord, all the anxiety vanished. The chemistry was instantaneous and undeniable. Walsh's rough, aggressive, blues-soaked playing provided the exact counterweight the Eagles needed. It roughed up their polished edges. It gave them a sense of menace. The gamble had officially begun, and it didn't take long for it to pay massive dividends. The absolute validation of hiring Joe Walsh happened almost by accident during one of their early rehearsal sessions. The band was working on material for the new album, trying to figure out what their new sound was actually going to be. During a break in the action, Walsh was sitting on his amplifier, completely lost in his own world, mindlessly running through a guitar exercise. It was a heavy, syncopated, cyclical riff that he had invented simply as a drill to warm up his fingers and improve the coordination between his left fretting hand and his right picking hand. He was just grinding through this nasty, funk-infused rock riff over and over again, treating it like a technical drill. Glenn Frey happened to be walking across the room. He heard the massive, snarling tone of Walsh's guitar echoing off the walls. Frey stopped dead in his tracks, turned to Walsh, and yelled over the noise, "What the hell is that? Keep that. That's not an exercise. That is a song." That simple warm-up drill became the explosive opening riff to life in the fast lane. The song was a massive departure from anything the Eagles had ever done. It was hard, it was funky, it was relentless, and it was entirely built around Walsh's menacing guitar work. The lyrics perfectly matched the aggressive tone of the music. Frey had recently been terrified out of his mind while riding shotgun in a Corvette driven by a notorious Los Angeles drug dealer known simply as The Count. The dealer was flying down the freeway at 90 miles per hour, aggressively weaving through heavy traffic. Frey, gripping the dashboard in pure terror, pleaded with the man to slow down. The dealer just looked over at him, laughed a manic laugh, and shouted, "What do you mean? It's life in the fast lane." Frey took that terrifying experience and married it to Walsh's aggressive guitar riff, creating a song that perfectly captured the dark, hedonistic, and incredibly dangerous underbelly of mid-1970s Los Angeles. It was a mirror held up to a culture of excess, and it proved that with Joe Walsh in the lineup, the Eagles could rock just as hard as anybody else on the planet. With the new lineup solidified and a fierce new sound taking shape, the band decamped in early 1976 to Criteria Studios in Miami, Florida, to record what would become their undisputed masterpiece, the Hotel California album. The decision to record in Miami was a strategic one. Henley, Frey, and their brilliant producer, Bill Shimchick, wanted to get the band out of Los Angeles. They wanted to remove themselves from the endless parties, the hangers-on, and the constant distractions of the Hollywood scene. They figured that by locking themselves in a studio on the East Coast, they could focus entirely on the music. Of course, this was the 1970s music industry, so instead of avoiding distractions, they simply brought the distractions with them, or found new ones in Miami. The recording process was incredibly grueling. It was a clash of work ethics. Henley and Frey demanded absolute sonic perfection, forcing the band to record take after take after take until every single note was mathematically flawless. Shimchick was a master of tape splicing, literally cutting and taping different pieces of reel-to-reel audio tape together to construct the perfect performance out of dozens of separate takes. Walsh, true to his nature, was a completely improvisational creature. He didn't want to play the same thing 50 times. He wanted to capture lightning in a bottle on the first or second try. Bridging the gap between these two completely opposite philosophies fell largely on the shoulders of the band's other lead guitarist, Don Felder. The environment at Criteria Studios was electric and sometimes hilariously chaotic. In a brilliant piece of rock history trivia, while the Eagles were agonizing over the acoustic guitars in one room, the heavy metal pioneers Black Sabbath were in the adjacent studio recording their album Technical Ecstasy. The sheer volume of Black Sabbath's amplifiers was so incredibly loud that the bass frequencies were literally bleeding through the walls and ruining the Eagles' delicate acoustic takes. The Eagles actually had to pause recording multiple times just to wait for Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler to stop shaking the building. Despite the chaos, the magic was happening, and it all centered around a demo tape that Don Felder had brought to the band. Felder had been sitting in a rented house on the beach in Malibu, strumming a 12-string acoustic guitar, when a unique, haunting chord progression fell out of his fingers. He recorded it onto a cassette tape on a primitive 4-track recorder, laid down a basic bass line and a drum machine beat, and gave it to the band. His working title for the instrumental track was Mexican Reggae. When Henley and Frey heard the cassette, they instantly knew they had something incredibly special. The chord progression was undeniably eerie, cinematic, and deeply captivating. Henley and Frey took the music and began crafting a lyrical narrative that would serve as the centerpiece of the entire album. They wrote a dark, surreal story about a weary traveler who checks into a luxurious but sinister hotel that he can never leave. It was a brilliant allegory for the American dream, the loss of innocence, the corrupting nature of the music industry, and the inescapable trap of fame and excess in Los Angeles. The song, of course, was Hotel California. They spent weeks meticulously tracking the instruments. The acoustic guitars were layered with stunning precision. Henley's vocal delivery was haunting and flawless. But the song was an epic narrative, and an epic narrative required a massive, unforgettable climax. It needed an ending that would leave the listener completely breathless. It needed a guitar solo that would define an entire generation. And it was in this exact moment that the massive gamble of hiring Joe Walsh paid off in a way that absolutely no one could have ever predicted. The final 2 minutes and 12 seconds of the song Hotel California contain what is universally regarded as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, electric guitar solos in the history of recorded music. This was the moment where the contrasting styles of Don Felder and Joe Walsh were forced to collide, and the result was pure, unadulterated magic. The recording of the solo was an agonizing process that took 3 full days of intense, focused work. Felder and Walsh sat side by side on stools in the recording studio, their amplifiers isolated in other rooms. Felder was armed with his legendary 1959 Gibson Les Paul, a heavy, magnificent instrument that delivered a thick, creamy, heavily structured, and profoundly melodic tone. Walsh sat next to him holding his Fender Telecaster, a guitar that naturally produced a biting, aggressive, twangy, and wildly expressive sound. They were 2 completely different players wielding 2 completely different weapons. Initially, they tried to approach the solo the way Walsh approached most things in life, by just winging it. They plugged in, cranked the volume, and started jamming, trading licks, and improvising over the backing track. But Don Henley, sitting in the control room, immediately hit the talkback microphone and stopped them cold. Henley had been listening to Felder's original primitive cassette demo for months. He had memorized every single note of the rough placeholder solo Felder had recorded in Malibu, and he demanded that they follow that original melody. He didn't want a sloppy jam session. He wanted a composed, structured masterpiece. What resulted was a brilliant compromise between strict discipline and wild expression. Felder and Walsh began to take turns stepping into the spotlight. Felder would play a precise, soaring, beautifully constructed melodic line. Then, Walsh would answer him, tearing into his strings with ferocious, bluesy, string-bending attitude, his playing dripping with menace and unpredictability. They traded measures, passing the musical baton back and forth, pushing each other higher and higher, creating a sense of escalating tension that is palpable through the speakers. Finally, as the solo reaches its absolute peak, the 2 guitarists lock in together. They abandon the call and response and begin playing the iconic descending twin guitar arpeggios in perfect, mathematical harmony. The contrast between Felder's absolute structural discipline and Walsh's unhinged, chaotic energy created a sonic tapestry that was utterly flawless. It was the exact sound of the Eagles shedding their quiet, country rock skin and transforming into untouchable rock and roll titans. When the Hotel California album was finally released in December of 1976, the impact on the cultural landscape was instantaneous and earth-shattering. The album rocketed straight to the #1 spot on the Billboard charts and stayed there. It sold millions upon millions of copies in a matter of weeks, fundamentally redefining the band's career and completely altering the trajectory of popular music. The massive, terrifying gamble had worked. The music industry insiders who had laughed at the idea of Joe Walsh joining the Eagles were silenced forever. Joe Walsh hadn't destroyed the band with his chainsaws and his chaos. He had saved them from their own sterile perfectionism. He provided the exact ingredient they were desperately missing: a shot of pure, unadulterated danger. The album would go on to become one of the highest-selling records in human history, an achievement that simply would never have materialized if Bernie Leadon hadn't poured that beer, and if Henley and Frey hadn't had the crazy, desperate audacity to hire the most unpredictable madman in the music business. While the massive world tour that followed the album's release would be legendary for its sheer excess, eventually causing the band to implode and break up entirely by 1980, that is a dark story for another day. Because for that brief, shining window of time in 1976, the Eagles managed to harness the pure chaos of Joe Walsh, bottle the lightning, and create absolute perfection. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real, untold history of one of rock's greatest moments, do not forget to hit that like button, leave a comment with your favorite Joe Walsh moment, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next documentary. Until next time, keep the volume turned all the way up.